just have a few brief remarks as a bookseller on the history and philosophy of science before we introduce Dr. Crick. Scientific thought has for centuries occupied the writings of scientists and philosophers of science. Earlier examples of this kind of speculation include the physics of Aristotle, Sir Francis Bacon's Novum Organum, and the works of that other Cantabrigian, Sir Isaac Newton. A Cantabrigian is one who is a member of Cantabriensis, the University of Cambridge, as opposed to an Oxonian, or a member of the University of Oxford, Oxonian. So bear in mind the word Cantabrigian. I will be referring to other Cantabrigians. The processes of scientific discovery are at times baffling and peculiar, and do not necessarily follow a strict, logical, and linear path. For example, in Ludwig Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations, he liked to use the example of the duck rabbit. It was actually devised by a psychologist named Jastrow. If one scientist looks at a problem, it looks like a duck, but another scientist might look at the same problem and it looks like a rabbit. Attempts to explain some of these processes of scientific discovery have included such other Cantabrigians as C.D. Broad in his book Scientific Thought, Lord Russell, or Bertrand Russell, in the Scientific Outlook and other works, Principia Mathematica, for example, and Sir Alfred North Whitehead in his lectures Science and the Modern World. A more recent Cantabrigian, James Watson, wrote a popular account of the work done in Cambridge University with Francis Crick on the discovery of the double helix structure of DNA. Since 1966, Dr. Crick has been in residence at the Salk Institute as the Kiekhaefer Professor, thinking about the brain and color and other matters. Dr. Crick has recently published his account of the processes that led to the double helix, as well as some of his work on the brain. Let me jump back for a moment to the processes of scientific discovery and the nature of the inductive method in science, where a model is imagined and then tested. For example, if Linus Pauling and his group of scientists at Caltech and Maurice Wilkins in London, or Rosalind Franklin in London, are all and Francis Crick and James Watson are trying to figure out the double helix, they're all approaching it from different perspectives. One might be in category A, one in B, one in C. Francis Crick and James Watson were working with a model involving phosphates on the inside of their helical structure, and it wasn't working. And it was Francis Crick who said to Watson, why not build models with the phosphates on the outside of our structure? It was that insight that led to the successful model which has passed the test of time, and which exemplifies one of the seminal minds in science in our century, Dr. Francis Crick.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen. And apparently I'm now so decrepit that I have to talk sitting down, but it's very comfortable, so I'm not complaining, and I do sympathize those of you who have to stand up. Usually I'm the only one standing up, everybody else is sitting down. Well, you've heard a little about me. Those of you who don't know will obviously hear that I'm English, and it's when I go to England, people don't notice that. I speak to them on their phone, and I have to introduce myself. But when I'm here, I just say hello, and they say, "Oh, hello, Francis." However, we have lived in La Jolla for the last 12 years, and before that, I used to come here. I've been coming to La Jolla since the Salk started, which was in the early 60s when I was a non-resident fellow. Very briefly, before that, to start after my undergraduate career, I worked during the war for the British Admiralty, where I designed circuits for mines and things like that. And it was in 1947 that after 2 years after the end of the war, that I went to Cambridge and studied what we now call molecular biology. It didn't have a name in those days. And as you've heard, Jim Watson and I put forward the double helix in 1953. After that, I was concerned with the genetic code till about 1966. Then I got interested in what's called developmental biology, embryology. But when I came to the Salk, I decided really that I would get interested in the brain, and I'll explain why in a moment. Now, as for the book is published under the auspices, it's published by Basic Books, but it's published under the auspices of the Sloan Foundation. Now, the Sloan has a scheme whereby they encourage scientists to write autobiographical accounts of their work for a lay public. And in a rash moment, I signed a contract to say I would do this, but it turned out I didn't really want to write that sort of book. Much as I like gossiping about my friends to other friends, I'm not sure I like gossiping about them in print. And what the book I wanted to write was more about the sort of ideas we'd had in molecular biology, and in particular the mistakes we make, because you learn more, I think, from your mistakes almost than from your successes. So I reached a compromise with the Sloan Foundation. They allowed me to write my book, and then they complained that I hadn't put enough autobiographical thing, which explains why there are anecdotes of various sorts. Incidentally, the anecdote about Jim Watson and the phosphates really goes that indeed I said to him, why don't you try the phosphates on the outside? And he said, but that would be too easy. Which I said, then why don't you do it? Now, it sounds a very silly exchange in a way, but what he meant by the too easy is there were too many ways of doing it. And my argument was, let's have one way, whether it's right or wrong. And that is the type of discussion that you have when you're tackling a scientific problem. Well, now let's go back to the beginning and ask, how did I start as a scientist? My parents weren't scientifically inclined. They couldn't even, well, of course, and I say mend a fuse. You don't mend a fuse here, but in England you do it with a funny little bit of wire. But they couldn't even mend a fuse. But at an early age, I must have shown a general scientific curiosity about the world, and they had the good sense to buy me a children's encyclopedia which covered all sorts of subjects, covered not only science but literature, history, and so on, most of which I read with great interest, but particularly the scientific part. And I began to do experiments at home. They weren't really experiments. The favorite one was to blow up a bottle by means of an explosive mixture inside, connected to the mains by a little bit of wire, and you press the thing and the bottle went up like that. It was really terrific. But my parents were a little anxious about that. So a compromise was reached. I could blow up a bottle provided it was immersed in a pail of water. So you can see they were doing their best to encourage me, while at the same time making sure that I didn't do anything too dreadful. Well, during the war, of course, most scientists were not allowed to go into the armed forces, and I was directed to go into the Admiralty, and after the end of the war I decided I didn't want to go on the rest of my life making weapons, but I didn't really know what it was I wanted to do. And this was a great puzzle to me, because by that time I was about 30, and that's usually a time in people's career when they can't change, scientists that is. They've made such an investment in what they've trained in and what they've got their PhD and their early research. Very difficult to make a change. Well, I realized that was fine. I didn't have that experience. I couldn't use my wartime experience and so on. But in a sense that makes it more difficult. It's like the kids found, well, some of you for that matter, in the 60s. When you can do anything, it's not very clear what it is you want to do, unless you're very dedicated, very musical, or something like that. And then one day I noticed that I was telling some of my friends who were naval officers, I was telling them about penicillin or something like that, which I realized I knew very little about. And I thought, that's very funny. Why are you selling with such enthusiasm something which you only have a most superficial knowledge? In other words, I was gossiping about it. And so I invented what I call the gossip test. If you want to find out what you're really interested in, see what you gossip about, because that really shows, you see. Well, then I had to find out what I was gossiping about, and I found I was interested in two areas of science in particular. One is the borderline between the living and the long living. That's what we would call molecular biology now. And the other one was the problem of the brain and the problem of consciousness and so on, which would nowadays be called neuroscience or something of that sort. And so I decided, by using this gossip test, that I would do one of those two. And then after reflection, I decided, well, perhaps I knew a bit more about molecules and so on, and I'd better go for molecular biology. It happened a week later, some of me offered me a job to work on the eye. And it was a very difficult decision, because I said to myself, now last week you said you were going to do molecular biology, and now this week you're going off and doing the other one. And I thought that won't do. So I actually turned down the job, actually a paid job, and accepted a studentship. I became a student again. I was helped by my family. Now, you have to ask, what was it about these two subjects that made them particularly appealing to me? And I have to explain a little to you about my religious upbringing. Now, my parents were what is called nonconformists. That's to say, they weren't members of the Church of England. They were Christians, but they were not members of the Church of England. They were, in fact, what is called Congregationalists. They were not especially devout. We didn't have prayers at home. And I was told not to mention to the members of the church that my father played tennis on Sundays. So that gives you the general atmosphere, I think. But nevertheless, they were believers, and at some age, which I don't record, like 12 or something, I announced that I didn't believe in any of this, and so on, and didn't want to go to church. Well, my mother was upset, but, you know, she accepted it. And so what I realized was that the two areas I was interested in are the ones which contained in those days really quite deep mysteries concerned with us fairly personally, which science had not got an answer to. Of course, by that time we had an answer to, you know, the basis of chemistry. Quantum mechanics was already known and things of that sort. Not when I was 12, but shortly when I was making this decision. And on the other hand, the borderline between the living and the long living, and what was the nature of genes and things like that, that was thought to be a rather way out thing. And the problem of consciousness, which I'll come back to, is still thought to have something of that character. So that was really why I chose those things. Well, I won't go into all the details of how I got to Cambridge. The people I had worked with in the war helped me, and I went and I was told I mustn't go and do things physicists do straight away. I had to go and do some tissue culture, so I get used to at least looking at living cells, if not living animals, and so on. And I had the great good fortune in my career of having younger collaborators, usually 10 or 12 years younger than I am, such as Jim Watson and Sidney Brenner, and that, I think, helped me greatly in the things that took place. Well, now, so that explains how I got into the subject. And now let's skip over. I don't think I want to explain to you just what DNA is, because I find that if you haven't learned about it at school, you forget immediately afterwards. And if you have learned about it at high school, you know it anyway. So I don't think I'm going to explain exactly the whole point of the DNA structure, because you can read it in lots of popular books now. And in my view, it's not very difficult to grasp. It's not as difficult as ideas like relativity or quantum mechanics, or even the more difficult things they now have in physics. It's a relatively straightforward idea, which if you play about with Tinker Toys, it comes very naturally. So we used to call it Meccano when I was a boy, but now I think they call it something else. Let's go on and ask, which is one of the themes of the book, what are the lessons, what are the sort of things that one learned, which are not absolutely immediately obvious? And I say they're not immediately obvious because among my newer colleagues, I see them making the same mistakes again, that, as it were, we made, or shall we say, some cases avoided. Probably the most important thing one has to realize is that biology is not like physics. And this is especially important to explain to physicists. I don't think I actually said, but my first degree was in physics with a bit of mathematics. So I had to learn, of course I'd done a little chemistry at high school, I had to learn organic chemistry and biology and so on at the age of 30 or so, at least the elements of it. So biology isn't like physics, and for a very good reason. Biological objects have evolved by natural selection, and that is a very special process. It has many variations and so on, which we don't understand all the fine details, but we do understand it in outline. And as I think it's fair to say that in physics you do not find anything like natural selection. And what you have in physics are very powerful conservation laws, conservation of mass or conservation of mass energy in certain circumstances, conservation of momentum, of angular momentum, laws of that sort. And the important thing to realize is those laws are the same everywhere, as far as we know, everywhere in the universe. If you went to another galaxy and another sun, another planet and so on, or wherever it is, as we can tell from by studying the light that reaches us from the stars, the laws of physics, at least to a very good approximation, are the same everywhere. That isn't true of biology. Maybe if there's life in other worlds, they use natural selection, but the way it's evolved would be different. And you can see this by looking, for example, take a very simple case of the animals in Australasia, where essentially you have kangaroos and marsupials, animals of that sort, and you didn't have the other sort of mammals that we are until people took them there and so on. So in other words, things evolve differently, and if its life started again, we believed it would again be different. It's a situation which is nowadays referred to as chaotic, that a very tiny change in the initial conditions can make a very big difference after a reasonable period of time. Well, what implicate? All right, so it's different. So biology is different, but what is the difference? Well, the difference is two things which almost sound contradictory. When natural selection finds a particular bit of chemical gadgetry, it tends to hang on to it, so that if you look in a yeast cell as to how it handles energy, it's not very different from the way it's handled in your own muscles. So there's a certain uniformity in all throughout nature. DNA or RNA, the related molecule, is the genetic material. Proteins are the catalyst. There are small counterexamples now, but the general rule remains the same. And so that you get that aspect of it. But the other thing, which was emphasized by Francois Jacob, is that evolution is a tinkerer. Having got some process and wanting to use it for something, it will fool about with it and make small modifications, add additional mechanisms. So what at first may be quite a simple process turns out to be very elaborate. And this is true of DNA replication. The idea that Jim Watson and I had was a very simple idea. It could have all been done with one catalyst, with one enzyme. We now know that you may need 15 or 20 enzymes to do all the different jobs. There are error-correcting mechanisms, things for unwinding the helix, all sorts of gadgetry which has been added. So it's very important, if you're trying to get a theory in biology, not to try and produce a physicist-type theory, which is elegant and so on, uniform, powerful, as opposed to a lot of gadgetry and tricks. You'll see this if you look at your automobiles. Your basic idea of an automobile is just an internal combustion engine driving four wheels with something you can steer. But you must have noticed there are all sorts of knobs that raise and lower the windows and all sorts of gadgets for altering the temperature and this sort of thing. And if you didn't know about that and just went and looked at a motor car, you wouldn't be quite sure what the primary thing was, unless you had some insight into what the process is. So another rule you get from this, that if you want to test a theory in biology, Occam's razor, the idea that you should have the simplest theory, may be a dangerous tool, and that elegance is not enough. And in the book it explains an example called the Commodus Code, which was a very elegant code. It was deduced from first principles. You had the feeling it ought to be right, and we know now it's completely wrong. See, one of the advantages of molecular biology, it's a very sophisticated subject nowadays, and we can often say categorically, such an idea that we had in the past is wrong. It's not like subjects like psychology, where all the old sort of ideas people have simply float along and never get entirely discarded because they never come to the right answer. So this is the advantage of molecular biology. You can use it to sort of sort out good ideas from bad ideas. So you shouldn't use simplicity as a guide. Of course, you couldn't make things hopelessly complicated. You have to have a certain feel as to the way evolution would do things and try and adjust your theories in that way. And that's not easy to acquire, I would say. There's another thing which occurs in other branches of science and is I think, very common and is very surprising Well, let's put it surprises one the first time it happens. So you're dealing in what we call the fog of research, because in the front of research, everything is in a fog. You're groping with things, you glimpse a few facts, you get misleading things, and so on. Now, the remarkable thing is that one false idea or one false observation can sometimes throw you completely off the track. And again, in the book, it gives one or two examples of this. So that you have this funny thing that when this idea is corrected, or when you suddenly see that it's wrong, and so on, sometimes everything simply falls into place, which was almost inconceivable the previous day when you were still groping in the fog. So you have to realize that it's very important constructing a set of ideas, especially in biology, but it would apply in other branches of science as well. You must examine your premises, your ideas and your observations. You must go back and say, reject them, whatever assumptions were, like the assumptions we made originally that phosphates were in the middle, things of that sort. And this is one of the reasons why I think it helps to have a collaborator, because one of the things one notices that when you have an idea, you get too fond of it, and you see all the things that fit and you tend to brush aside the ones. Darwin was a very honest man. He made a note of anything that he came across which was opposed to his ideas. Most people don't do that. I must say I would find it too devastating to do that. One feels one should do it, but it's difficult to do in practice. So it helps if there are two of you, and that you can discuss things very freely and candidly. Because in that circumstance, if one of you has an idea, the other one almost instinctively attacks it and tries to show up the weaknesses and so on. And it's that toing and froing which happened between John Watson and myself, which didn't happen between Maurice Wilkins and Rosalind Franklin. For they didn't get on, and they didn't have that opportunity. And as you probably know, she kept saying it wasn't helical, and she said it was, and they never really got to grips as to what to do about that. So I think that in these more speculative things, it really helps. And why does it help? Why couldn't you do it? The reason usually is that it is not one logical step that you need to take to go from where you are to a new idea. If it was one thing, it would be easy. Usually it's a succession of 2 or 3 logical steps, each of which follows from the other. If you go wrong in any one of them, you'll go off in the wrong direction. And therefore, if you're going to thread your way through these maze of theories and try and, as it were, spot which is at least approximately the right one, it helps to have somebody to travel along with you and, as it were, jolt you out of any cul-de-sac which you can very easily get into. Another thing which our host mentioned, I think obliquely at any rate, is that it's a question of how do you establish an idea. Of course, in science, you never prove that a theory is true. You make it more and more plausible, is the proper way of describing it. What I'm going to say is, how do you show it that it's true? Now, I think what you find, and that was in this diagram with the A's and the B's and the C's, that it often, the clincher will come by looking at the problem from a different angle and having a different experimental approach. You have one sort of technique which you apply. In the book, for example, there's a case whereby by genetics we worked out that it was probably a triplet code. And we could have gone doing genetics till the cows come home, improving the evidence a little, but it wouldn't have been totally convincing. We realized at that point that you want to switch to biochemistry and show that a quite different technique, by looking at the biochemistry of the actual molecules and not the breeding pattern, which is what genetics is. By looking at the biochemistry, you could prove this hypothesis from a totally different angle, using the same genetic material, incidentally, but doing the biochemistry on the products of the genes. And that was actually done by Streichinger and showed that was decisive. And this, again, is something which I think people like psychologists have to learn. You cannot establish things in psychology by just doing psychology. You've got to use some other method which will come in independently and confirm it. Ask yourself, why is it we believe the world is round? Well, nowadays it's so clear from the photos you have in space that people don't argue about it, but if you go back 50 years, there were lots and lots of reasons. But the important point was that all those different reasons, like the curvature of the Earth and so on, the image of the shadow of the Earth on the Moon and so on, all gave approximately the same diameter for the Earth. It wouldn't have been a good idea if one gave a big diameter and another a small one. one. It's the fact that different methods converge to the same sort of numbers. And when that happens, then you have confidence in theories. Well, so much about the sort of things covered in the book, and perhaps I should say a little bit of something as to what I do now. Well, as you heard, my main interest, I decided by the gossip test that my main interest was in molecular biology on the one hand and the brain on the other. But of course what I did was molecular biology. I knew people who worked in neurobiology. I had friends. I knew a little about the subject. I actually didn't know very much. But when I came to the Salk, by which time I was 60, I decided, well, it's now or never. If you don't go into it now, you'll really be too senile to cope with it. So I announced that I was going to switch to the study of the brain. It took me 2 or 3 years to get away from the things I was involved in and get right into it, but nowadays my main interest is in how the brain works, and particularly how the mammalian brain works. And I say that because, of course, what we're really interested in is in our brains, but it sometimes helps to study monkeys and cats and things like that for technical reasons, rather to concentrate just on things you can do with human beings. So that essentially was what I do. It isn't that I'm not interested in the molecular biology of the brain, which has become quite exciting now in the last few years, and I obviously follow to some extent what goes on in molecular biology. Well, what do? Well, I don't do experiments. I don't swear that I never will do experiments, but the fact is, experiments take a long time. There's a long discipline to be learned to do experiments in these things. They're not like doing phage genetics, which I describe in the book, which you could learn in a week or something like that. It's more difficult, and I think maybe one would be tempted to do it if I thought I had a really winning idea and I couldn't convince anybody else, and I thought I had to do the experiments myself. But that situation hasn't arisen yet. Now, the next people ask is, how big is your group? Well, my group consists of myself and half a secretary. Actually, that's as much as I can employ her. She used to work for Renato Del Becco. Now she does other things, but I employ her half-time. So you can see that it's not a very large group. So what do? Well, what I try to do is to learn about many different aspects of the brain. Starting at the bottom, I'm obviously interested in the small molecules which are involved, the neurotransmitters which send signals from one nerve cell to another. I'm interested in the macromolecules, the sort of molecules on which the small molecules sit, the channels through the membranes which let ions in, which are the signaling process, all that kind of thing. Then I'm obviously interested, going up a stage, in neurons, what their properties are, the different sorts of neurons, and so on, which all of these are subjects which we need to know very much more. Working up from that, one then is interested in the different arrangements of the parts of the brain. It may come as a surprise to some of you to realize how little we know about the brain. Now, for example, the easiest way is to contrast it with the rest of the body. We really have a good idea of what the heart does. We've known it since the time of Harvey. And you can say what it does is synthesize a lot of serum albumin, it does all this, detoxification and so on. And we know what the kidneys do. Now, when I started, we didn't know what the thymus did. We do know what the thymus does now. It's very much involved with the immune system. It's difficult to find any part of the body which you can't give at least a good outline description, which is supported by many scientific experiments, as to what it does. But when you come to the parts of the brain and ask what the thalamus does and what the cerebellum does and what the basal ganglia do and things like that, well, you get an answer, but I'm not sure it's going to be the same in 5 years' time. And I think we're in for a lot of surprises. So that's one of the things you learn, that although we have a good idea in a rough way, vision happens at the front and of your the back, of your neocortex, and you have touch and so on here, and the motor part there, you can go with all those things. But there are lots of regions, even of the neocortex, especially the frontal regions, we don't know what they do. And we only have a very sketchy idea of something like the hippocampus. So naturally I'm interested in all these things, how they're connected together, what the connections do. Again, knowledge is coming along at a slow rate. But you can't stop there. You have to ask, if we knew all that knowledge, we would still not know how an animal did anything. So you have to look now into the behavior of animal and people. You have to look, in fact, into psychology. And bits of psychology, there's one bit of psychology called psychophysics. Sounds like some strange California religion. but all it means is that you do experiments as to how people see things and how they can distinguish different shades of color, for example, and how good they are at doing verniers and how well they can do things when things are moving. That's called psychophysics. Well, obviously that's a very important point. So this is really the psychology of the senses, of the inputs to the system. And I think I'm less concerned with emotional things, although this is an approachable problem, and more especially with vision. Now, the reason one is interested in vision is twofold. First of all, we human beings are, like the monkeys and the apes, are very visual animals. It isn't really true of mammals as a whole. If any of you got a dog, you notice it does it mostly by smell. Its eyesight's not very good. And when the lion has that majestic look, the male lion, I must say, peering over the horizon, it's because he can't see very well. He is, incidentally, the ultimate male chauvinist. He makes the lionesses do all the work, and then he comes along and takes the first dig into the kill. But that's by the way. So I'm interested in vision, but you can't be interested in vision without being involved with other things. So that one naturally was interested in memory, and there are different sorts of memory. Some of you may be surprised to know that the memory of what you had for breakfast, you can probably remember what you had for breakfast, that's called episodic memory, it's of an episode, is not the same sort of memory as the memory of the meaning of the word breakfast. And you can have brain damage such that after a quite short time you won't remember what it was you did have for breakfast, because that part of your brain has been destroyed by one condition or another, and so on, but you can easily remember the meaning of the word breakfast. So you have to realize that the different things which you think are much the same are often done in different parts of your brain. And if you have brain damage like that, you can not only still drive a car, but you can learn new skills. You may have an apparatus, say, to do mirror writing, and you are taught this skill, and you are taught it over several days. Each day, if you have brain damage of this sort, you will deny that you've ever seen the apparatus before. But each day you get better. And if after a week you're pretty good, and they test you 2 years later, you're still pretty good. So there are at least these three sorts of memory. Memory of how to do things, play tennis, things of that sort on the one hand, memory for episodes on the other, and this more semantic memory, and so on. So this is what the psychologists tell us, and what we would like to know is how we relate this to different parts of the brain. What changes in your brain when you remember something? We now know one of the key molecules, and a lot of people, including some of my colleagues at the Salk, are now looking for the gene for one of these key molecules. So even memory is getting down to a molecular basis, even though we still don't know too much about it. And also interested in attention. I don't know if many of you realize that, of course, one form of attention is the way you move your eyes about. That's a fairly simple form. Most people, without thinking, have the view that you can see everything with great detail simultaneously. But that isn't true. You just look straight ahead. Look straight ahead and see how much you can see out here. You can't see very much. It's rather the resolution is rather poor. But of course, the fact that you can move your eyes so quickly and see it gives you the illusion that you can see it all at any one moment. So that you do have these illusions in the way your brain works. The brain deceives you in so many ways, let me say. But the ultimate problem, of course, that we want to tackle is the problem of awareness or consciousness. Now, until the last few years, by few years I mean 3 or 4 years, people were rather leery of this subject, partly because there was a movement called behaviorism in the earlier part of the century, especially in America, which banned it as a topic and said you could only study the animals or the person's behavior, and you mustn't make up ideas about what was happening inside the head. There's now been a counter-revolution. It's now called cognitive science, and you are allowed to make up theories as to what happens in people's heads. And it's now almost becoming respectable to talk about consciousness again. Now we know, and in fact it was well known before Freud, that much of what goes on in your brain when you're seeing something, for example, must be unconscious, because we can, as it were, dissect the process by doing, giving people various things in the visual system to look at, and from that behavior we can deduce there must be certain processes which you're not conscious of at all. For example, you just realize one thing. You normally see with a two-dimensional picture projected onto this retina, but what you actually see is a three-dimensional picture of the world. And your brain has to construct that three-dimensional picture out of these two-dimensional ones, which is very clever of it. You may say, well, that's because of the two eyes, you see, but you just shut one eye and look round. I can see that this gentleman here, for example, is in front of that green, that plant there, because he occludes it, you see. But then I have to be able to see him, remember, in order to work out what it is that is occluding that. It's not a straightforward process at all. You must realize that scientists have a minority view about this. The great majority of scientists believe that what goes on in your brain is merely, I don't really mean merely, but I'll say merely a lot of neurons, nerve cells firing, and the chemistry associated with it. You don't normally think of yourself as a lot of neurons, but in 100 years' time you will, because that's what you are. At least that's what I think you are. That is a hypothesis. We have not yet proved that this is the case. And one of the key problems that you have to answer is, what is the neural basis of conscious awareness? And this is a very tricky problem, and I can't say that I can see it. I know it's tied up with problems in attention, with problems in short-term memory, and something which I won't go into called the binding problem. All these problems are a set of problems, and we now believe we are on the edge of a breakthrough in this, where we may have a new way of looking at the brain and the way it behaves, which may lead us in this direction. The problem we can't answer yet, and I personally want to leave it on one side, is what the philosophers call the problem of qualia. Why red is red and blue is blue and things of that sort. That turns out to be very tricky, and is not at all clear that it is a real problem, and I think is best left on one side. Well, I think that gives you an idea of what I'm interested in, the sort of thing I do. And finally, people will say, yes, but what else do you do? Well, we travel a little bit from time to time. I like the lawyers so much, I'm trying not to travel. My idea is, if people want to travel, let them come and see me. It's much simpler than my going to see them. We go to the theatre, we go to concerts and so on. We have social life. And some of you may be surprised, because I have a reputation of somebody who can't do anything with their hands, that I actually do some gardening. In England we had quite a large garden in the country. We had a little country cottage, and I used to grow lots of roses. Well, I think that's really enough to tell you how I started, what I did, what I'm doing, what I'm interested in, and if you like to ask questions, if I can hear the questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Thank you. Please.
Do you think that any of the theories in physics, the grand unified theories and all the advanced theories and from quantum mechanics, and as well as your own theories from biochemistry, do you think that they shed any light on what types of theories might come about from the study of psychology or consciousness? Any key or any pattern?
Well, there are physicists who believe that, but I don't. The question is whether the theories in physics will have some close relationship to psychological theories. That's essentially what you're asking.
Or biology.
Well, for example, people are very, very excited now about the idea of chaos, which is one of, it's not quite what you mentioned, but that's one. And we certainly wonder whether there are states of the brain which are in some sense chaotic. When you come to problems of free will, it's possible you have to think of ideas of that sort, using not it in the narrow technical sense, but the broad sense of a small change making a big change in the result. The weather is probably partly chaotic in that way, that it's probably unpredictable beyond a certain distance. There are physicists who hope that it will go the other way, but I don't share that point of view.
I read something about rapid eye movements and dreaming and how you thought your brain was actually erasing stuff.
Yes, the question is about rapid eye movement sleep. As most of you know, you have two forms of sleep. One of which is a sort of go into a deep sleep and have rather slow wave brain waves, and the other one, which is sometimes called paradoxical sleep, because you're asleep, but if you look at your brain waves, you appear to be awake, and so this is and this happens to you every night, or to most people almost every night. You go through a 90-minute cycle, of which some part of it is in REM sleep, a total of about an hour and a half. And not only that, but almost all mammals, with one or two notable exceptions, have it. And we had an idea about that. And people say, well, how did you get interested in REM sleep? Because it wasn't any of the things you mentioned. I didn't mention it in what I said before. And the answer is we were thinking about how lots of nerve cells might interact together, a subject known as neural nets. And because of that, they don't behave very well when you overload them. And we thought of a method of improving that. And then we wondered whether that's what happened in REM sleep. So the basic idea is we did have a slogan, you dream in order to forget, because it's in REM sleep that you have most of your dreams. But I wouldn't say that now. I think you dream in order to separate things out in your brain which you're confused about. Now, if you the next time you dream about something or somebody, you will probably find that you dreamt about old Charlie or whatever it was, but in fact it's a mixture of people, perhaps with the same name or similar people. And Freud has many examples of this, including Irma, his famous Irma's dream, one of his patients. Irma in the dream had the characteristic of several of his patients, and that's the sort of confusion that you get in dreams, and that's it's something you can easily check in your own dreams, and he called it, it's translated as condensation. And we believe what you do in REM sleep by a special device is to push aside those things which are rather similar and you've put too closely together in your memory, because you don't store things in your memory in your brain in the way you do in a computer or a card index. It's more spread, and it's more like a hologram, loosely speaking. It isn't really like a hologram. Okay.
You said something about the psychology and that you needed other people to come in and confirm psychological theory. Who would that be, and what would it be, a different methodology, and how would it be more scientific?
It wouldn't be more scientific, it would be different. Well, for example, in the case we mentioned of memory, there must be alterations in the molecules of some sense, somewhere or other. So why not study that and see if that fits in with what you know about what the molecules are in the different parts of the brain, the different sorts of memories. So that would be an example of how you'd use a different technique.
I wonder, do you have any ideas along the lines of the relationship of kind of mind-body issues and how biophysics relates to psychological kinds of events?
Well, that's exactly what we're trying to find out, you see, in all these things. How is it, what happens in your brain in the terms of the nerve cells and the molecules when you see something? What happens when you pay attention? Because eye movement is only a very simple form of attention. There are other more subtle, faster ones which you're not really aware of, but psychologists can show. Right up to the question of awareness. That is that's the bridge we're trying to build. Now, we can build a bridge in the visual system between what happens in the earlier parts of the visual system, because it's a whole series of processes that starts of course in your eye, goes to the back of your brain, then works its way forwards, and we can relate some of the things that you would call psychology, on the one hand, how you see various things moving, what the color system can do, because there's a color system and a black and white system. The color system, for example, when you go to the cinema, you see things moving, although it's a series of stills. That's called apparent movement. The color system doesn't see apparent movement. It's a black and white system that sees that. So then you try to relate that to the wiring of the color system and the wiring of the black and white system and so on, along those lines. So you've stated what we want to do. I wish I could tell you we've done a lot of it. And the further you get things becoming more cognitive and more creative and more difficult and more human, the more difficult it is to explain. But the hope is that by looking at the earlier parts of the system, which you can then do on mammals, muscles on other animals, if we could find how those work, we could probably extrapolate to the higher parts, because the structure of our brains in the simpler parts is very similar to the structure in the more, what we believe, the more advanced parts.
Yes, I've been confused about something. I have read that the right hemisphere of the brain is larger in males and the left is larger in females. And so why do we talk mostly of women as right brain and men as left brain?
Well, I'm not sure that size is, I mean, it may well be true. And I don't talk about like that, so I don't... I mean, there are differences. Let's say what the major difference is. The major difference is that for right-handed people, left-handed it's more complicated, have the language on the left. It's not clear exactly how much language you have on the right. But if you knock out the left, if the left is knocked out by a stroke or something, what can you do? Well, you can usually sing, and you can sing songs, you know well. You can swear. You can do things of that sort. What happens on the what happens on the contrary? What happens if this side gets knocked out, so that the verbal part is retained? Well, then you have difficulty relating to the character of the voice. So you can't tell the difference between a man's voice and a woman's voice, and you mix up noises of different kinds, and so on. So that's certainly done on the right. So there were certainly differences between the right and the left. I think the differences between the sexes is very small compared with these major differences between the right and the left.
It's not true that women have thicker synapses between the two brains?
The corpus callosum, which connects the two, may be different, but you know, I'm not sure that's overwhelming.
Okay.
I mean, what people have done, you see, what they do is they take some little observation and then they try, as they say in California, to relate to it in some way. that means they make up their own theory and then they're very pleased with it.
Do you feel that everything about the conscious and unconscious mind is a product of the brain?
Well, that's my view, but of course we won't be able to prove this until we understand it in detail. I mean, people used to have an awful lot of trouble understanding, you know, how embryos develop and how genes work, and people said it couldn't be molecules and so on. We don't believe, we now have, because we have a much detailed knowledge, we believe we can answer questions. In the case of the brain, it's your opinion against mine. I mean, we don't know is the answer. Now, this is a program to try and find out. It may fail because we may have the wrong set of ideas, but that's the working hypothesis of about 95% of the people in the field. There is 5% who don't believe that, including some quite distinguished people.
You have the feeling all that anything survives, anything about the mind survives the brain upon death, or is it just all wiped out?
My own feeling is it's wiped out, but, you know.
Dr. Crick, in that vein, and also before I ask you a question, is it possible to repeat the question?
Yes, I'm sorry, I should do. I meant to, but I got carried away.
Very good. In that vein of thought, with regard to what happens, if anything, after death, the late Oxford philosopher A.J. Ayer recently passed away. Some years in recent times had his heart stopped for a few moments, and reported upon the regaining of consciousness that he had seen a red light. In terms of your research with color in the brain, have you come upon anything else in the literature that gives any meaning of substance, or is this just metaphysical nonsense with red light treatment?
Well, the question, the remark was that Freddie Ayer, who died recently, had an experience where his heart stopped for 4 minutes, and he saw a red light. It so happens I have the article by him, but haven't read it. I just dipped into it, so I didn't get as far as the red light. But when I get back, I'll read it. It's by coincidence. I don't think there's anything special there. No, it could have been anything. I would guess, but I don't even know exactly. I can't remember exactly what it was that made his heart stop. Who are we going to have? Shall we have somebody around here?
Would you be willing to comment on some of your ideas on the origin of life? I happen to have the readers up.
Oh, I see. Would I comment?
And if you have time, can you also discuss some of your ideas on the humans taking control of the genetic?
On the which?
Humans taking control of the genetic.
Well, I think I better keep off that one. The question was, would I say something about the origin of life? I can say things, but you won't find them very interesting. The first thing you have to say, the origin of life is a problem in organic chemistry. Almost everybody except chemists hate organic chemistry, so it's very difficult to explain it to them. They will like to think the origin of life is some great mystical thing, and so on and so on. And actually, people who work on it worry about how, chemical reactions go, how things fit together. And I have a distinguished colleague, a very old friend at the Salk, Leslie Orgel, who works on this subject, and what I know I really learned mainly from him. We had a slightly crazy idea that possibly life didn't start here, that possibly came from somewhere else in the form of microorganisms and unmanned rocket. My wife says it's science fiction and so on. I say it isn't quite science fiction. And it simply came from the fact that the age of the Earth is a little less than half the age of the universe, so that actually something like our form of life could conceivably have arisen and reached the stage that we have at about the time that the Earth was being formed. So that was one idea. Then the other idea was there are certain aspects of life which are very, very similar, if not quite identical, namely the genetic code. We won't go into the details. And so we wondered whether there was some bottleneck, and we thought, why couldn't it be a rocket? Well, I must tell you, this idea, which I put into a book, but the reason I put it into a book was simply because people hate chemistry. And what I wanted to explain was what the problem was. It wasn't that we had the answer. I merely put that in as a sort of something I could paint all the other details in relation to that. It isn't that I really feel it's terribly plausible. I can actually tell if people have read this book. It's called Life Itself. I can actually tell because there is a bit at the end saying what a scientific theory is, and is asking if this is a scientific theory. And people who haven't read the book don't know that, so I can tell by the questions they ask whether they've actually read it. On the other question of what we can do with our genetics, I think that's too difficult. I think I'll leave that one. Let's try somebody else, this lady here.
Yes, you mentioned Freud, Jungian and B.F. Skinner philosophy. Whose do you ascribe to? Who do you prefer to believe in?
I hate them all. But if you were to ask me, do I have a philosopher? I have a philosopher, and you'll be glad to know she's a lady. She's UCSD, and her name is Pat Churchland. And if you want to know what she thinks, you can read a book called Neurophilosophy, which is, I hope, going to be the new wave in philosophy. Okay.
Why do you hate them all?
Well, perhaps that was a little strong.
Why do you?
Because basically, I don't like the behaviourists because I think their point of view was far too limited. And they had a point, but they overstated it. And I think you should make models of what goes on psychologically inside the head, which they wouldn't allow. And and although much of what is done now I think is pretty sketchy, I think it's better on the right lines. In the case of Freud and Jung to some extent, one simply has to say that Freud wasn't a scientist. He tried to be a scientist, but he didn't know what a scientific theory was, and he didn't know how to test it. And what he really found, it was something more like a religion, which you weren't allowed to doubt the premises of the thing. So it's for this reason. It isn't that he may not have had some insights, for example. So it's always worth, and he wrote very well. That was another thing. But his really success came because he appealed to non-scientists. And although he was trying to be a scientist and had the program, he had the same program that we have to try and explain psychological things in terms of what goes on in the brain, the details. But of course it was far too early to do that, since we haven't got very far now. That's basically why.
I'd like to know what your thoughts are about self-awareness. Where does this arise from? Are you saying that to a certain point of complexity, are you aware of yourself? Are animals aware of themselves? Other mammals?
The question is of self-awareness as opposed to awareness. It's difficult to say. It's not an easy thing to define. People believe that that there is self-awareness in the higher apes, because they can recognize themselves in mirrors, and especially they do experiments putting marks on their forehead and so on, and they recognize that it's them. It's less clear when you go down to monkeys, and even less clear when you go down to other mammals and so on. And yes, the answer would be that it would, I think, be the process of awareness being applied at a sort of higher level. The brain is loosely arranged in a sort of semi-hierarchical way, and although we don't know this, we would certainly suspect that there are additional levels in human beings, and the particular level, of course, which we have and that the animals don't have, is language. Although you can try and teach a chimp sign language, it learns very laboriously, and it's fair to say it never learns syntax, it never masters grammar, for example, which a child will mop up very fast without any really very much effort. And it's because of language that we can have abstract thoughts, and which is probably very difficult for lower animals who react more directly, I think, in a way that I think we can imagine, but which is not the way we normally do it. So I think that would be the answer. I don't regard the problem of self-awareness as a difficult one. I regard the problem of awareness as a difficult one, and self-awareness as a special case.
What do you think of the Human Genome Sequencing Project?
Okay, what do I think of the Human Genome Sequencing Project? Well, personally, I don't only follow it at a distance. As you know, the person who's sort of coordinating it in the States is my ex-colleague Jim Watson. I think, in brief, I think it's a very good thing to do. Exactly which order you should do it and how you should do it, I don't know. I think the fallout in many branches of science, not merely the applied medical one, will be enormous. And I don't think the cost is prohibitive. So in general, I'm in favour of it, but I don't keep in close touch with it.
Has it ever puzzled you how the brain can understand itself?
No, I don't think find that a problem. I have a problem with how we can see anything. You must realise we don't have the faintest idea how you see anything, which is you think is a sort of simple, straightforward process, but not at all. And curiously enough, most of the experiments done on animals have been on animals under an anaesthetic who weren't seeing anything, but that's by the way. So I don't think that would be so difficult. I think once you've got the general way it works in one of these subsystems, and once you understand how the neurons are interacting together, I think we shall easily be able to tackle what looks like more difficult ones. I don't think it's the actual number, because it's very difficult to say when you go down in the biological scale where awareness would cease. But with most of us think that mammals would all be, at least I would, most people would think a dog or a cat would see in a loosely the same sort of way as we do. When you come down to frogs and fishes, you suspect it, but what about a fruit fly or a worm or something like that? It's very difficult. It's some emergent property, and it's not something that's yes or no. Now, I do think it would be difficult to have the awareness in the sense we have it if you had a small number of neurons, but I think you could have a brain with the largest number of neurons which might be perhaps less aware. I don't know, and until we understand the process, I don't think we can say. The moment we believe that it's probably tied in with certain oscillations in the brain, but that's too recent and too technical to, I think, go into.
Question up here. To what extent are we able to replicate human thought?
You mean in a machine?
Yeah.
Well, the key thing is thought. If you take the sort of thoughts that you need to or prove a theorem or something like that, it is possible to program computers so that they can prove theorems, given, have to, like anybody else, they have to have certain assumptions put in. They have to be taught how to do it as anybody else would. What is difficult for computers to do is what is called common sense, or even seeing, which is, I will perhaps repeat again, which I didn't, or say again, because I don't think I said it with enough force. You think you see, it's easy to see because you just open your eyes and you see. But in fact, when we analyze the problem, it's enormously complicated. And we have not yet got machines which can see anything like as easily as well as we do. I mean, they realized in the past 20 years in artificial intelligence, those problems are the really difficult ones. Now, the basic reason, I think, is that the computers that we use are what's called von Neumann computers. They're all the ones that you play with, and they have an if-so logical structure, essentially. And if you want to solve problems of that type, then you can simulate them fairly well on a computer. But when we see things, we believe it isn't done like that. It's been done by a new sort of computer, which is called neural networks, which are incidentally being developed by a number of commercial firms in San Diego as well as other places, which do the same job in a different way. But they're only at the beginning, and they're not in the spirit of artificial intelligence in the classical sense. So I think the answer is that you can do certain things with computers which have a logical structure. But when you have to, as it were, acquire tacit knowledge of something, let me give you an example. When children learn to speak, they learn to speak eventually fairly quickly and grammatically. So they tacitly know the rules of grammar and the rules of pronunciation. But they don't know them explicitly, as you'd soon find if you ask them. So your brain learns things in a tacit manner. And when you want to have something that can be done in a tacit manner, these new sorts of computations with neural nets are very powerful. Now, let me give you an example, which is a true one. People who apply for a loan now for appliances, they used to be screened by an officer who would ask them, do they have a dog, and what their income was and all that kind of stuff, and so on. And on the basis of this information, they would say whether they get the loan or not. I won't go through all the other methods they tried, but now they used one of these neural networks. They have an enormous backlog of cases of who was a good loaner, a good borrower, and who wasn't, and so on, which they can train these neural nets on. So you put in whether it had a dog and what the income was. You put all this information, and you put out, you tell what the answer was, good, bad, or indifferent, or something or other, and it adjusts all its connections, because these are things which have flexible connections, in such a way that it learns to deal with that set. It will produce the right answers. You then use it on another set which it hasn't seen. And because essentially they're very similar, it will produce the right, and these are used now. So it has tacit knowledge of what makes a good borrower, but there's nothing in the program. If you were to do this question up here, if you were to do an AI program, you'd have to put, if he has an income of 10,000 a year, then you don't let him borrow too much, and if there's an income of 100,000, so on. It's if then. You don't tell the machine that. You just give them all the examples, tell them what the answer is, and it learns now by very cunning what's called algorithm rules of how it adjusts its connections to produce the answer. And that's much more brain-like, as you see from the example we gave of learning a language.
Crick, who puts in the criteria? The good borrower is by definition one who pays the money. Does the neural net know?
No. You have to say what you regard as success. Okay? I don't say you couldn't use some other criterion and get the net to tell you that, but what would you use? You see, I mean, presumably what you want to do is to maximize your financial return, so you could perhaps carry it that stage that far. So, but no, it has to be told what the answer is, but it doesn't have to be told what the rules are. So you can divide problems roughly into two sorts: those in which you can formalize the rules, like geometry or something like that. You can formalize the rules rather easily in a logical way, or you can take what is called common sense problems, in which you have to, as it were, a feel for this, that, and the other. Those problems are best done by neural nets, up to a point. But of course you must put in the right data. If you have to select not only what the answer is, you have to select what data you put in. If you leave out an important bit of data, you may not get a very reliable performance.
Do you think there's something like a language organ in the brain?
I don't think there's a language organ, but there are certainly parts of the brain which are specialized for language, and which, for example, if you damage, you interfere with language in different parts, and they're on this left side, of course, and there's a bit at the back and there's a bit at the front, roughly speaking, and it's a bit more complicated than that. We don't know it fully, let me say. And in addition, if people are having operations for epilepsy, which the skull has to be cut open so the brain is exposed, for example, you can you can put a little electrode on the brain which will temporarily inactivate a bit, and so you can knock out certain things. So one case of a lady who was bilingual in English and Greek, and in some places you can knock out part of the Greek, and in some places you can knock out part of the English. But it isn't a separate organ. It's parts of the brain which are semi-specialized, which then talk to each other and talk to other parts of the brain. We won't find it in one little lump, in other words.
Have you looked into learning disabilities at all?
Well, I don't personally look at learning disabilities, but you essentially means the ones that occur naturally. The difficulty of that is that it does give you some insight into the way things are done in the brain by seeing what goes wrong, but until recently it was very difficult to know exactly where and what the damage was, so you couldn't easily pin it down to answer this lady's question, for example, to where things are. So you do get limited information from that, but not, I think, always crucial information. Now, I've got a written question here. Oh dear, oh dear. Can you tell us about chaos in the brain? Well, we touched on that, and I think the brain will have, parts of the brain will have that property, that a small change at any one time in the input or the way the neurons are behaving or something or other like that can make a big difference to the outcome. Well, we haven't got onto the question of free will, and I suggest we keep away from it, but I don't believe it's a serious problem for that reason. You have to understand about what is conscious and unconscious, and you have to have the idea of chaos. The other question is, what is your feeling on the makeup of the subconscious? Now, the subconscious is a very difficult thing because it's tied up with Freud, who invented the subconscious. But if you take it in a broader sense, as we did a little earlier, and say all those operations which go on in your brain that you're not conscious of, which is probably the large majority of them, incidentally, and so on, we don't know at the moment what is the difference between those operations and the one that you are conscious of. Now, Freud's subconscious involved motivation and problem and emotions and things of that sort, and would be a special class of that. So I don't think we would get very far at the moment. This lady.
Would you find it difficult to believe that an impact on this particular part of the skull could create, over a period of a couple of weeks, acute psychotic behavior?
Well, I'm surprised it's that part, but you're sure that the point is when you have an impact on your brain, the damage isn't always where the blow was, and so when we want to know more where it was, and you'd have to describe the behavior, but certainly blows to the brain can do damage. And incidentally, it's not widely known that boxers have a form of what is very much like Alzheimer's disease, which is presumed because their heads are being repeatedly banged about. But that comes on very slowly, not in 2 weeks. So I would simply without knowing what the damage is, would be difficult to say.
Dr. Crick, could you talk about whether you like long-term potentiation as a model for learning?
Well, that's getting a little technical. The question was, do I like long-term potentiation as a model for learning? Let me say very briefly, this is a phenomenon which is such that if you, that you can, by giving a nerve cell certain inputs, you can strengthen the connections of the inputs to that neuron. And the simple answer is yes, I think it's a very promising model. I don't think it's the only thing, and it is of course the one that is now associated with the molecule we mentioned, which I didn't say what it was, but is one of the 3 types of glutamate receptors, and if you knock out that particular receptor, you lock out long-term potentiation on the one hand, and equally if you give the same molecule to an animal running a maze, it will not be able to, it will lose its episodic memory. So I think there's enough to make it an attractive model without being certain about it. We'd have to be tentative all the time. This gentleman.
Yeah, I was wondering about genetic plasticity, and as far as how much the genes interact with the environment they're in. Because everyone's taught that you have certain genetic things, you have blue eyes or brown eyes or whatever, but how much is it that the genes are interacting with their specific environment as partners rather than just having a sufficient environment for the genes to manifest themselves?
Yes, this is a question about genes and the environment. I think the easiest way to answer it, because let me say we don't know the answer, we only know the general character of the answer, is again to consider language. The fact that all human beings do language so easily would certainly suggest there's a genetic component. But of course the language they learn depends on the language they're exposed to when they're young. So that's a matter of the environment. So I think that shows the sort of way things are going to go. But when you ask for more details, how much is it genes, how much of this, any particular case, the answer is we don't know at the moment. I think wait a minute, let's have somebody further back.
Given your involvement with the international scientific community, how do you perceive American scientific community versus other world scientific community?
How do I see American science against other science in other parts of the world? Well, I think it's still true that America is the leading scientific country in almost every subject. I mean, that's the first thing to say. Now, of course, that isn't necessarily going on last indefinitely. Some countries which would be in the long run would be very promising, like China, of course very backward because they've had so much turmoil, and however much they try to get going, they've got a long way to go. But probably the one you have to seriously consider is Europe. And European science, after all, taken as a whole, is improving all the time. Western Europe, and to some extent behind the Iron Curtain, and so on. If you look in other parts of the world, Japanese science is coming on now, but has been disappointing because they've tended, first of all, they've done better at engineering and applied science than they have at pure science, but that I think is changing, and they certainly want to change it. But if you look at many other parts of the world, the science is very... sometimes in relation to the size of the population, like Australia, for example, they do quite well. But if you were to take the whole of South America, for example, there is science there, and I wouldn't want to say it was negligible, but it's nothing compared with what we have what we have here. So I think it's still true that, and much of the excitement of science is still focused in the States, I would say. Let's have this one.
Do you feel that the neural network computers are going to offer insight into the human brain, or is it enough difference that there's not going to be a real area?
Do I think that neural networks can offer insight into the brain or not? I think we have to use models in the line of neural networks to understand the brain. I think we have to say the present models are much too simple. They've taught us a few general lessons which are very useful. The fact you can have a distributed representation, for example, the fact that learning algorithms will allow you to accumulate tacit knowledge, a number of things of that sort. But of course the aim of people, at least some people, the people working on neural networks, let me start again, roughly there are two extremes. Those who want to make something which is commercially useful, on the one hand, and they don't care very much how the brain works. They're happy to have a few sort of tips or get ideas from the brain. And the other extreme are people who are mainly interested in what the brain works, and there's a spectrum of people in between. Those latter people who want to know how the brain works have certainly got to make their neurons more realistic and their networks more realistic, and that will take some time. And I have colleagues at the Salk who are trying to do that. So I think you have to go that way, but I don't know, but we have a long, long way to go. We've only just taken the first step, is really what it comes to.
Some of the things you're saying seem to sort of pull the rug out from all the basis for religion. If the research bears fruit, how do you deal with that, sort of giving people, in a sense, the feeling that there's nothing left, or that, you're taking away all the basis for religion? What do you leave people with?
Well, I don't, people say that, but I do think there is something that, but scientists don't seem to suffer from that themselves very much, in my experience. But I think there are problems. See, you have to realize what a peculiar position we're in. We were evolved, essentially, for most of the crucial part of our evolution as hunter-gatherers. We weren't evolved to do science. I mean, that's an accidental byproduct. We have these very useful hands, for example. They were evolved to do all sorts of jobs, and killing animals and doing plants and so on, gathering from plants. But of course we use them for playing the violin and the piano and things of that sort. And we use our brains for science. But we haven't been evolved as far as I can see. In other words, over the time that science has been going, which is a very short time, no matter really essentially just a few hundred years, there hasn't been any change in human makeup. Consequently, we're going into a way of life which is something we haven't evolved for. What the scientists have to explain is the need that we have for religious feelings and so on, and why people believe in them so strongly, and things of that sort. Those are the scientific problems, and ultimately, presumably, they have to produce something in the way of scientific myths or things that appeal to ordinary people who don't like equations and tight arguments and things of that sort. They have to produce something. I can't say I look forward to it, because once you set up something as a sort of church, it gets, it becomes rather narrow in its point of view, and wants people to everybody to believe the same and so on. But we have to look forward to something of that sort. So I think there are real problems as to what is the real basis of religion in terms of our psychological needs and so on the one hand, and how do we provide something in the lines you say. I would say, however, that I don't think it's as bad as people feel. I think it's a matter of what you're brought up to. If you're brought up to a religious education and you lose it, I think then you do have a deficit. But if you're brought up to a more scientific point of view, the world, to my mind, is much more fascinating from the scientific side. The size of the universe, the vastness of everything, the marvelous things we discover, the illogical nature of quantum mechanics and things of that sort, I found quite as marvelous as what ordinary people who, in the pre-scientific era found marvelous. So I think there's plenty of marvelous things, but I do agree with you, we are going to have a difficult period, yes.
I'm not making a case for religion. It just seems like you're sort of left with explaining why things are just so perceptual, and that's about it. And it's almost like, almost dropped here.
No, because I think you have to think about motivation, which I hadn't discussed at all, for example, you see, and emotion and things of that kind. And we know, broadly speaking, the sorts of the parts of the brain which are involved with those things, very crudely, and so on. But we hope to have a much deeper insight, but not yet. I think. Where's my host? I don't know how long you want to go on.
Here he comes. He's right behind you.
Oh, you get back in
do we want to, how long do you want me to go on?
As long as you feel comfortable.
Well, I feel comfortable, but all these people standing, I'm sure they don't want to be here forever. Let's take one question from that lady at the back, then we'll stop.
Do you think it's possible that two neurons could send so many decibels over, or, connect with each other so many times that they could more or less fuse?
Can two neurons fuse? Not as far as I know. No. They touch over a very short distances at the synapses, but well, it is true you can have electrical connections, which is like fusion, but they're not very common in our brains. So the simple answer is occasionally you get something that approaches to that, but in general not. So perhaps we could close it there.